Hi everyone, welcome. My name's John Clarn. I am RICS staff, qualifications and assessment guidance manager, so responsible for all of the content and support that we put out for those interested in gaining an RICS qualification. So I'm just going to talk briefly at the start, just 5 simple points for you to remember, taking you through what the process is of gaining the RICS conservation accreditation. The others on the call are all RICS members, and we'll have much more exciting slides and pictures, I'm sure, as well, from what I've seen compared to the ones that you'll see on my slides. So as I said, I'm just going to talk through 5 points for you. We've got one standard at RICS, and we assess to one standard so that employers, clients, and the public can be assured that individuals have the competence to work on buildings of significance. And this standard has been established since 1992 and is recognized widely as providing a rigorous and transparent credential within the historic environment. So that was one standard. To gain that one standard, there are 2 stages. There's a submission stage and an interview. All RICS members are eligible to apply. The basic caveat being that you have current and suitable experience in order to demonstrate the competencies. To apply, you will write a written submission and then proceed to an interview. Your submission will be used by the panel of assessors to question you at interview and to determine whether or not you do have suitable experience and the competence to achieve the accreditation. And the interview starts with a 10-minute presentation from you and then continues with 50 minutes of questioning and discussion with the panel. We've got 3 submission deadlines throughout the year, and from that submission deadline you can expect a result following the interview within 2 months of that submission deadline. So those are the 2 stages. Number 3 submission elements. So the submission's really important because it is the first time the assessors will read about you and get a picture of your experience, and they will use your submission to help determine the questions, the line of questionings that they're going to take during the interview. So there's 3 elements: your personal statement, and that is a 500-word summary of your experience, and it should set out your position on building conservation, referencing your relevant career history, your education and your training. So it's really a chance to put across why you got involved in building conservation, and what your approach to that is and what you hope to achieve within your career. Next, oh, sorry, not next slide, just next on this slide. Next, we've got the 5 case studies, and those will be about 500 to 750 words each. And I'll go into a little more detail on those on another slide. The final element is a CPD record. Obviously, as RICS members, you're all familiar with completing and uploading your CPD. What we want to see in the submission is any of that CPD that is directly relevant to building conservation, and the assessors would expect you to have CPD within there that shows how you're maintaining your competence in building conservation. So those are 3 points. We're now on to number 4. So we've got 4 competencies, which you'll see on the screen here. Those 4 competencies are what the assessors will be basically marking you against to ensure that you can demonstrate your experience in those 4 areas. Across the 4, you're expected to demonstrate an ability to deliver a sustainable conservation philosophy. They want to see a breadth of experience and also an appreciation of your client's objectives. Those are kind of 3 principles that sit across all 4 of those competencies and how you apply those in the work that you do. And then finally, we've got the 5 case studies. So I don't know if any of you have come across any buildings of significance that look like any of those, but the 5 case studies really are the most information that you're going to give to your assessors, and across all 5 of them you should be presenting a coherent narrative of your experience. So as much as you'll be talking about different projects, different pieces of work that you'll be doing within those projects, different outcomes, they really want to get a picture of a coherent philosophy and your approach to conservation. So within each of those 5 case studies, you're going to be describing, providing a brief description of the monument, building or site, and then going into detail to explain your conservation philosophical approach, your role on that project, the client's objectives, and then the outcome. And what we encourage you to do as well is to provide appendices. We're not necessarily looking for, pages and pages of appendices, but it's really useful given the significance of conservation and the particular projects that you're working on. It's really useful for the panel to see pictures of the building, whether that's drawings or photos, and then also you can supplement your appendix with specifications, schedules, and extracts from reports. So it kind of brings the project to life, and along with the written case study, it gives the assessors a lot of important information that they can use when they're assessing you at interview. So those are the kind of 5 key points. We've got 1 standard, we've got 2 stages, 3 elements to your submission, where you're going to demonstrate 4 competencies, and most importantly in your preparation of your submission is the 5 case studies. As I mentioned, there's 3 submission deadlines each year. The next submission deadlines are the 30th of July and the 30th of November. If you are interested, please get in touch. Happy to provide any support. But I'll hand over now to Kinley, who is going to go into some more detail about the competencies, but I'll be staying on for any questions now or at the end. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody, and hope you're enjoyed the morning and your appetite's been whetted to apply. My name's Kinley Laidlaw. I'm a conservation accredited building surveyor, and I've also been an APC and a conservation accreditation assessor, so thought it might be useful if I could give you a few tips about preparing an application. My career really has spanned both private practice and a long period within the National Trust for Scotland as a building surveyor, and now as a consultant. And so just to go into the first slide there, just preparing your application. I want to just spend a wee bit of time on the pre-application stage, gaining experience. It's a very broad subject potentially, and you know, it can cover buildings really from traditional construction buildings, tenements, through to castles, palaces, vernacular buildings, and it's interesting that the building doesn't know that it's a tenement or a castle, but it could be constructed in exactly the same way, and it's really how people perceive the difference culturally and significant as to how these buildings are viewed. And so we've got a very interesting role, both from a technical perspective, but also from a social perspective, really working with clients, with owners, with the public, and so on as well. It's very rewarding, but as it's been already said, it's potentially a huge subject, getting into all sorts of different areas of construction beyond. So it can take time to gain the experience, and it really just depends on the stage, I guess, in your career, and the area you're working in, how easy that would be. So first point I just want to make is the quote there: accreditation is only awarded to individuals who are prepared to maintain exemplary standards. That's really from the RICS applicants guide, and it just really underlines the need that we are professionals, and the clients are giving us potentially a lot of responsibility to maintain heritage and look after their interests. The application process, if you have the correct experience, the right experience, right depth of experience, is potentially reasonably straightforward, but you do have to put the effort in, and it's hopefully a little bit easier, less stressful than the APC process. But the RICS isn't expecting you to be an expert, although you may be in a certain field. Nobody can really be an expert in every field, so it's really looking that you are a safe pair of hands, that you know what you're doing and you know where to go. One of the issues is knowing your limitations, I guess, as well. So know where your expertise maybe needs to be supplemented by others, and also capacity as well of you and your practice. These are important elements of showing competence. So take time to think about all of that. There's, as I've put at the end of my slides show here, you'll see a number of points of guidance where you can find more information, where you can find a lot of CPD, but don't rule out undertaking a conservation qualification. It's not a requirement of the application process. However, although it's a significant undertaking, it's a very good way of gaining context and additional knowledge to supplement your career and other reading you may be doing. So I just want to ask you to consider the question between how a chartered surveyor and a conservation accredited surveyor might differ in their approach to an instruction with a traditional or a historic building. I'm not going to try and answer that just now. I just want to let you dwell on that one and think about it, and it may come up again in some of the other speakers this afternoon as to how that can be very important distinction, and how that may affect the outcome. So shall we go to selecting case studies here? Firstly, your personal summary that John mentioned preceding this is very important because it helps the assessors understand the area in which you're operating in and your experience. And that just helps the assessors set context. As I was mentioned already, you're not expected to be an expert, and particularly depends on what stage you are in your career. It gives a wee bit of background to you. So in finding the case studies, it's important to try and select a range across from one end to the other, perhaps of your experience. They don't have to all be, in fact, they don't have to be at all large, complex, all singing and dancing conservation projects on castles and so on. They can be single issues that you have found interesting that you can use to justify and demonstrate your thinking, because I have to emphasize, it must demonstrate your thought process. 500 words is not a lot to convey a topic or a whole project, but you can seed your case study with hooks and supplements, appendices and so on, to prompt questions and so on that. But it's really to focus on issues that you have tackled either within a larger project or individual small issues. You can take issues out of a larger project if they help, and you could even use the same project twice if it demonstrates more than one point. Doesn't have to be a project as well, to emphasize that. It could focus on a survey or even research. So there is it widens it out to give you a bigger range of things. Move on to the competencies. As John said, there are 4 competencies listed within the guidance. Remember that this is not an application to demonstrate your competence as a surveyor. That's already granted, as you've already qualified. Therefore, so and really looking at the distinction, as I mentioned earlier, between the surveyor and the conservation surveyor. Conservation philosophy, and the first competency, you get the opportunity really to explain your approach. That's potentially a more difficult one, and as an assessor, it's often one that can be light. So it's necessary really to think about this one quite carefully, that you can justify a method of thinking, a process that balances all the multiple issues that you have to work through, and the tools of conservation are there to help you in that process. You really must have a sound, round understanding of what these are, and you may not have written them all yourself, but you should have familiarity with them and potentially commissioned them. But things like heritage impact assessments can be used on a day-to-day basis in your work. Construction techniques. There's potentially a huge range of construction materials, types of construction in the vast time period that construes pre-1919. Again, your area of work is important to come across. Perhaps if you're working in a city centre site most of the time, you're unlikely to have had live experience of perhaps a thatched vernacular building, but nevertheless, you can still read about it, perhaps undertake CPD, and broaden your understanding of these things, because you may move, and you may move area, whatever, during the course of your career. Understanding how these materials perform, how buildings perform and deteriorate, how they can be modified by decades of alteration and development. It all comes into to that category. Also, diagnosis of defects. Perhaps the surveyor is expected to be more of a speciality in this field, but nevertheless, sort of building detailing, climate change, original detailing perhaps not being as good as it might be, poor repairs in the past, all affect the performance of a building, things that you may pick up on during a survey, and have to balance whether you improve it or leave it alone. Working back to the conservation philosophy point. And then project management, hugely important to manage the repair, even if you've come up with a brilliant identification of issues and solutions. Getting the right people together, managing the team, your people skills, how you brief a team to ensure that the conservation aspects and priorities are understood by those who are helping you to make decisions. The client is very important and critical in this whole process, that they understand too, and are brought along on the journey. In the field of building conservation, extra importance in keeping good records and providing a maintenance plan as well at the end, so that others can see what has happened and the decisions that have been made during the process of the project. So there's the 4 competencies. I think it's in selecting your case studies again, you've got the opportunity to pick 1 or 2 or whatever of each of these competencies to focus on within your case studies as well. That can be a useful way, because again, I go back to the opportunity to convey a lot of information is quite limited. So you can pick the case studies that suit a particular competency, if you like. And then I could just go to the references there. As I mentioned before, there's an awful lot of information out there to support the building conservation profession, really. And start with the RICS building conservation accreditation guides. You must take a lot of time to read that and understand it. And I would point to the RICS guidance note as a good all-round document with lots to dip into there. The Guide to the Conservation of Historic Buildings has a very, very good explanation and guide to the process of conservation. Historic Environment Scotland, we're very fortunate that HES have been extremely active and supporting the historic environment, not only policy, but funding and guiding a huge amount of research, publishing guidance, and providing CPD right across the whole field. Similarly, English Heritage, and a lot of guidance available online there too. Must point you to the ICOMOS charters. The Borough Charter is perhaps one of the best known, and just a really excellent a description of how the Australian ICOMOS looked at conservation of their sites. The HLF have some very good guidance available, as have conservation bodies which you may wish to join if not already a member. And once you're into these, you find you're in forums with a colossal amount of conversation, debate. There's often no right answer, and you gain just a huge amount of rounded experience and knowledge from these sources. So that's hopefully giving you a wee bit more background information. I hope that's been helpful, and I just want to pass you back to Gemma, I think now, to introduce the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kinley. The next speaker that we've got is going to be Jessica from HES, and she'll introduce herself properly, but she's going to talk about some case studies for you.
Hi there, thank you Gemma, and thank you Kinley for setting out the background to the case studies and the assessment procedure. It leads quite nicely into my presentation, which is really just to look at to one case study, but to give you an overview of sort of how to go about preparing one. So I'm Jessica Honeysett. I work for Historic Environment Scotland. I'm a district surveyor for the Central West region of the Historic Environment Scotland estate. And I'm very lucky in my job. I have the opportunity to look after or help look after a wide range of historic buildings, scheduled monuments, listed buildings, many castles, and even a cathedral. I'm not going to be talking about any of those buildings today because they didn't form any part of my application for conservation accreditation. My case studies were all much more ordinary buildings, if you like, although each one very special in its own way. But you really don't have to be looking after, you know, castles and palaces. It can be ordinary houses, tenements, cottages, churches, buildings like that. So it's an important thing to remember. Previously, I've also worked as a local authority conservation officer, and I also spent quite a bit of time working in the technical research team at Historic Environment Scotland before taking up my current role. And I achieved my APC and also my conservation accreditation while working in what I would call a non-typical surveying role. And I think it's important to remember for all of you that don't ever feel that you have to be doing something that everybody else is doing. Your experience is valid, and you can be gaining useful and relevant experience even if you're not doing what you might think of as typical conservation work or typical surveying work even. So I had 5 case studies. Here they are. At the time, I was doing quite a lot of work on energy efficiency. That was a sort of a big topic and a big area of research that we were working on. So I've got a couple of energy efficiency retrofit projects in there. I've got a fairly small scale hot mix mortar reharling and external fabric repairs on a hall house in Shetland. An energy efficiency retrofit of a Victorian lodge building, which included refurbishment for retail and interpretation, and that's the one I'm going to talk about today. I also did some external fabric repairs on 2 buildings in Mid Causeway in Curras, and another thermal upgrade project and installation of radiant heating at Scots Tarvitz Cottage, another Fife building. my fifth case study was an academic one. Kinley mentioned you can use, one of your case studies can be research or an academic project. And that's an opportunity for you to demonstrate if you've done some research work and you have an in-depth knowledge of a particular technical or conservation issue, you can also use that as one of your case studies, which can give you a little bit more scope. So my case study at Holyrood Park Lodge was an energy efficiency retrofit of a Victorian lodge and refurbishment for retail and interpretation centre. So the brief from the client, it was an internal client, was to convert this lodge building, which was an underused office and storage building, had some messing facilities inside, but it was really very underwhelming and underused building, although in a very prominent location. So the client wanted to turn this into a meeting space, an exhibition space, and a shop. So the first process in preparing this project really was the research and assessment of the significance of the building, and that really should be the first step in any conservation project, to understand the building that you're going to be working on. So looking at the listing description, or if it is a listed building, or the scheduling description if it's a scheduled monument, can be an interesting and useful first step, but it won't always tell you very much because the list description can be extremely basic. So don't sort of rely on that to give you the information that you need about the historic building. It's also very worthwhile looking at any archive information you have, any information from the client or the owner, using the facilities available online as well, such as Canmore or Buildings of Scotland. So do what you can to find out as much as you can about the history and the significance of the building. So it was a fairly traditional Victorian lodge building, but it had a higher status perhaps than some because of its location, which was in Royal Park. It was domestic in scale, but part of a wider landscape, a designed landscape, and it had a number of other sister lodges throughout the park, which was really useful for comparison and research because there were some features that remained in some that were missing in others. The building was fairly modest really on the inside. It didn't have at first appearance very much left in the way of historic details. And sometimes that can be really important to note because it means that in the absence of, fancy cornicing and detailed sort of fireplaces and external details, you have to really look at what are the things about this building that still exist that make it important and contribute to its significance. And in this case, it was certainly small details. So the internal joinery, for example, the windows, the original floorboards that were there, the plaster mouldings that did remain, these all sort of gave me information and contributed to the significance of the building. I think it can sometimes be a risk that when looking at more modest buildings, overlooking ordinary elements such as the windows or the floorboards, and seeing these as sort of disposable or replaceable can also risk harming the significance because particularly on modest buildings, that it's the sum of its parts, and if you lose even fairly ordinary elements, you can risk losing significance. And what I found was that the surviving fabric elements were actually a little bit more extensive than first thought, which is often the case when you start to uncover things and take off later finishes. You might find that what you thought was plasterboard is actually original lath and plaster, or there's details that are hidden behind later finishings or coverings. So the conservation approach that took to the repair and refurbishment of this building was initially based on a desk-based investigation of the development of the building so that I could have a really good understanding of what it was for, how it had been put together, and what its status was. The intention was to retain finishing and fittings from significant earlier phases of the building. So it had been through a number of iterations, a number of refurbishments, and not all of them were, had as much significance as others. So, for example, its early phase as a lodge building for the Park Constabulary was deemed to be of more importance than perhaps more recent phases as a storage unit and a meeting room, which had in fact harmed its significance in some ways. The intention was to remove, therefore, unsympathetic modern materials that had been put in during this time, such as wood chip wallpaper and flush fire doors that had sort of damaged it and harmed its appearance, and undertook refurbishment proposals which are based on an understanding of the existing fabric within the building and surviving historic features within the 4 other lodge buildings of the same date within Holyrood Park. So had good evidence for the approach to the reinstatement of features, including, for example, the fireplace. There was an existing fireplace within one of the other lodges, which gave us a good clue as to the type and construction of the fireplace that we ought to put back in. And looking at the sort of technical aspect as well, it was an energy efficiency refurbishment project. Because it was a traditional solid wall building, I looked to use insulation materials which were based on the principle of allowing the building to breathe, maintaining the ventilation paths and avoiding impermeable materials or finishes. Continuing with the refurbishment aspects such as upgrading the windows, it would have been easy and perhaps even more straightforward to replace the windows in the entirety. But although the windows weren't original, they'd been replaced actually in the 1980s. They had been replaced in a sympathetic way. They were in good condition, so it wasn't good practice to remove these and sort of put them in a skip. So to upgrade them instead, the solution was to replace the existing single glazed units with a slim profile double glazed unit, which retained the windows without affecting the aesthetic of the windows. Aspects such as, sort of how you go around discussing with the contractor how to do things is also an element that I think is important to talk through. The aim, obviously, with this refurbishment was to retain as much as possible of the existing material. We had to take the floors up because we needed to insulate underneath them. And initially the reaction was, well, the floorboards are in very poor condition. We don't think we can really save any. And I would say that in this situation, we sort of didn't want to take no as an answer straight away, because the intention was to save as much as possible. And often there is a solution, it might just be a little bit trickier. So in this case, actually it was found that after taking the floorboards off and up and taking them away to the joiner's workshop, the contractor was able to save a lot more of the flooring than initially had been thought possible. So keeping this sort of the client's determination to retain as much as possible and the conservation approach that's desired, solutions can often be found even if they don't seem immediately possible. And just to continue as well with the decoration, the paints that we used were breathable clay paints, again to ensure the continued health of the building and following the conservation approach of allowing the building to breathe. So there wasn't really anything of major sort of conservation sort of drama or huge significance going on in that case study, and nor was there in any of the other case studies, but it still enabled me to undertake all the steps that you would do with if you were doing a refurbishment to a stately home. You still do the same level of research, understanding the building, look at the appropriate conservation approach for that building and how you can implement that within the parameters that you have. So just here then to remember, Kenley's already touched on this point, that the assessment is not to determine that you're a competent surveyor, because you've already done that. And I've read through quite a few conservation accreditation submissions, and I think it's really easy to get stuck in the APC frame of mind, where you're very, very keen to demonstrate what a good and competent surveyor you are. And of course, you do still have to do that, but that should come through with everything you're doing in the conservation assessment anyway. But really, it's much more important to demonstrate the thought process that you've gone through, the reasoned assessment of the significance of the building and how your interventions have impacted that or could impact it, and what mitigation you might take. So that's really your heritage impact assessment. You need to ask yourself with every project, have you demonstrated that you really understand the building, the appropriate conservation approach, and the steps that you've taken to determine that, and can you set that out in a reasoned and critical way? And have you advised your client on the need for and benefits of a conservation approach, which can often be, it can be a battle sometimes, but it's part of being a good surveyor and offering good client care as well. That sometimes the conservation approach can in fact be cheaper, it can be more efficient, it can offer other advantages for your client. And remembering again that the appropriate CPD, that can really be, it can cover a multitude of sins in a way. If you've carried out really good CPD and identified the knowledge that you lack, you can demonstrate that through your CPD, even if your practical experience is more limited. So that was just really a quick whistle stop run through one of my case studies. And at the end, happy to take any questions, but thank you and good luck, everybody. I'll pass back to Gemma or whoever the next speaker is.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you, Jessica. So our next speaker to go through some case studies is Antonio, who's joining us from GLM. So I'll let him introduce himself to you guys.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Antonio Cabello. I'm a technical architect originally and a chartered building surveyor. I came to Scotland for 6 months, 10 years ago, and having worked for NTS for about 4 years, where I gained my qualification as a chartered building surveyor. I joined GLM, a building surveying and architectural firm, and what we do is basically helping public and private clients in the maintenance, reuse, and adaptation of historic buildings. So yeah, I am going to talk about a little bit on how I did select my case studies, and then we will go through briefly a couple of them. Right, so let's crack on. Yeah, the case studies. I think one of the main difficulties for the candidates is actually the selection of the case studies. At least it was my case. For me, it was, you know, a bit difficult to find the right ones. I mean, the case studies are the tool to demonstrate to the assessors the level of competence and allow them to see if you meet the requirements to achieve the accreditation, as John and Kelly said. There are 4 mandatory competencies which have to be demonstrated to some level, and therefore having the right case studies and selecting the right one is key for the whole process. From my understanding, each case study has to show your substantial involvement in a project and try to illustrate as many of the competencies as possible. And this is a typical case in the real project scenario, where you don't deal with a specific issue. You deal with the whole situation where a few challenges are presented at the same time. So good examples of case studies are repair projects, maintenance projects, alteration and conversion projects, but also you could use survey work as well, you know, condition surveys, canal surveys, and so on. So the assessors at the end, they will assess or they will take into consideration the variety of projects and the complexity, the degree of the conservation issues presented, but also the way you appreciate the client's objectives, the way you apply the recognized charters and best practice standards as well. So yeah, the first point, the first and foremost thing in my case was actually knowing where I was, right? So you should know how far or close you are from achieving the level required to be accredited. So my first recommendation is actually doing a self-assessment and write down your main strengths and trying to identify the areas where you are lacking. That will give you a very, very helpful guidance in order to trace and prepare a plan. I think that's the key for the success, having a plan with some structure, targets and deadlines. Having the opinion of a colleague or manager or a peer or whatever work with you is very handy as well, because you will have a more objective idea about where you are. And when you have that, it's, you just write down where you need to go, how far you are, and start tracing your plan. I mean, I think, as John said, there are 3 sessions a year, so you need to find the suitable for you and the most realistic. So yeah, how should a good case study be? Well, I mean, a good case study doesn't need to be the perfect conservation project. You don't need to be dealing with, amazing, fantastic, glossy buildings and castles and palaces. And we tend to think that that's the case, but that's not correct. A good case study is where you are able to identify a conservation issue and you explain how you dealt with it, right? It can be something very simple, where a clear conservation issue is identified, assessed, managed, and resolved. The important is the way that process has been dealt with, and the decision-making process you follow, the research where the decisions were based on, and how the decision-making has been informed, and all in accordance with the relevant conservation charters, guidance, and best practice. Different case studies can be perfectly based on the same project, the same building, and we will see that was my case. As long as you demonstrate different aspects of conservation. I mean, typically, an historic building, presents a lot of conservation challenges, so there shouldn't be any problem for that. How to identify them? In my case, I thought there was 2 ways. Looking back retrospectively, seeing what I've done before to get to that point. And once I knew that, and based on my self-assessment, looking forward. So you see the areas or knowledge or experience where you are lacking, and that will give you very useful information to actually design a plan, what I need to do next. For doing that, you could do, projects within your organization, but actually you could ask, other people, colleagues, organizations to join them as a placement, secondment, or just go in and find the right CPD. There's a lot of CPD available now, so there shouldn't be any problem. So yeah, in my case studies, I tried to illustrate the variety of projects I dealt with in the past. So I include a wide range of them. The first one was some repairs to an historic glass house. The second case study was some repairs to historic weir in a very ideal location and a nice settlement site. The cases 3 and 4 were based on the same building. That's something we're going to look at in the next slides. And I put them because I wanted to demonstrate what I said before, how a historic building will present so many challenges and you have to deal with in isolation. And then my case study number 5 was a conversion of a list B property into a holiday accommodation. So there was an unused or underused building, and the owner wanted to reuse that to get more income, to contribute to the regeneration of an historic site. So yeah, let's move. These cases 2, 3, and 4 are based, as I said before, on the same building. It was Canary House, a listed B property in Perthshire, which was originally built in 1770, of original Georgian style. Was altered and extended over the years, and we have a combo of different styles and period, all of them with some kind of significance. And the property was used as a private dwelling for about the long life. After a period of time between 1980s to 1991, where I was converted into a hotel. Our client wanted to revert back the hotel converted house into a private dwelling. So we had to do a lot of work to achieve that. The case study number 3 was actually about some fabric repairs. We were initially commissioned to undertake a detailed pre-acquisition survey for the sale, which was prepared with one of my colleagues, and in which we identified some defects affecting to the historic fabric, especially some roof problems and some problem with the stonework, where the maintenance repairs were not enough at the moment, and they all need to have a more a deeper approach and get them repaired properly. So post acquisition, GLM, my company, was retained to actually continue with the process from specifying and detail the remedial repairs to procure the works and then oversight the works on site, and securing the necessary consents to achieve that. So I was appointed as a lead consultant and project manager and contract administrator for that project. And yeah, after once we were commissioned to carry on with the project, I carried out myself a very detailed inspection in further detail that the pre-acquisition survey we did before, to have a comprehensive understanding on the condition of the fabric, the defects, and trying to find the cause of defects. And during that survey, we identified some problem connected with the rainwater disposal, causing some damage to the roof and the stonework. And as I said before, in the past, the maintenance approach was more a reactive patch repair approach, and they never did any comprehensive repair, and all the works they did were not informed properly. So we find a lot of incompatible material and wrongly executed and designed details, which were actually making the problems even worse. So once the private client came to us asking for advice, we all agreed that the building was worthwhile to keep as it was, and we wanted to keep the main essence of the story fabric, and we were having a minimal approach strategy by only doing what was strictly necessary. We've got some assistance from the Scottish Lime Centre Trust to help us to specify the right mortars and the right stone for replacement. During the inspection, we found that there were some still remaining original slates, which were Aberfoyle slates on the Georgian wing. However, some of the latest additions were reslaid with poor quality Welsh slate, and they didn't have the proper overlapped, and there was some problems with water ingress through it. We decided to remove these purely executed and quality Welsh slates and reslate everything back to diminishing Scots slates. So we tried to find a matching replacement slates, and what's very difficult to find Aberfoils. So the decision we agreed was actually trying to reuse as much of the original slates in the most prominent slopes of the building, and then using a new second-hand reclaimed Scots slates to the rest of the building, because there wasn't enough slate to reslate the building with the Aberfoils, and actually Aberfoils are quite soft and they were not easy to redress again. So yeah, I mean, likewise, when we moved there and we put the scaffold, we confirmed our previous scope of works for the stone repairs, and we detailed and carefully specified stone replacements. The clients were at the beginning a bit reluctant to keep the old stone. They thought, oh, we spent a lot of money in this house. We wanted to have a shiny and brand new house looking. But there was an education aspect there, trying to make the clients aware of, you know, the significance and the importance of having a building like that, and actually explaining them the legal and statutory aspects of, you know, being the owners of a building of significance. So yeah, we proceed with some fabric repairs to keep the building winter watertight. We made some upgrades of the rainwater disposal in order to accommodate them as per the new climate demands and the climate change. So we explained that probably at the time of design of the building, you know, the guttering system was enough to cope with that amount of water, but nowadays, you know, climate change are making the situation more difficult to deal with, and as a result, we asked them to consider upgrading the rainwater good system to cope with potential current and future scenarios with linked to the climate change. And we put the consents required because there were some changes requiring listed building consent. So that's what we did, and that was my case study number 3. And the number 4 was a different project on the same building, which was run at the same time pretty much, but it was about the interiors. The house has some sort of features there. Most of the interiors were of Edwardian period, and some of them were Robert Lorimer's details, but there were also some interesting wall paintings by the Duchess of Atholl in the drawing room. So we have a scheme of doing some internal alterations to convert the building again, as I said before, from a hotel to a private dwelling. And that means decommission some of the hotel services and installation, and removing some of the fire safety lobbies and fire doors, but actually adapting the layout to the modern life and the demand of a family house in the countryside. But that wasn't really difficult. It's bread and butter, and there wasn't any objection when we put these things to the planners before putting the formal listed building consent. But probably one of the most challenging things I ever dealt with in an internal alteration project was actually the request of the client of removing some of the wall paintings in the drawing room, which were probably the most significant internal feature of the house, and specifically listed in the Historic Scotland listing information. So we proceed to explain and try to re-educate the client about the importance and significance of them, and actually making them aware of the statutory and legal duties. But the client insisted, and we didn't want to compromise and make things very difficult, because the worst case scenario could be the client going to a local decorator and asking the decorator to paint them over, so the wall painters will be completely lost. So we needed to find a compromise and trying to do the very, very best from a conservation point of view. And we approached some conservators we used to deal with and work with in the past. And we came with a solution which pretty much consists of putting a system that will cover the paints, but is able to be peeled out in the future with a very little damage to the historic paints. So in terms of preserving the historic feature, at least we know it's safe there, and there's no risk of the client to go on their own and painting them over and lost the paint forever. So it was a long process, and we put consent, we get consent granted, and finally we kept everybody happy. And that's pretty much my cases to this. So yeah, you will see they don't need to be the best and perfect conservation project. You need to be able to identify a conservation issue, clearly identified, and explain the decision-making process. Sometimes there's not a right or wrong solution. So the important is about how you get to that point, what makes you to make the decision, where you inform the decision, how you did the research, and that's the key thing here. So thank you very much for your time, and again, good luck. And if you need any help from me, you know where I am. Thank you. I'm passing to Yem again.
Thanks, Antonio. That's great. So we're wrapping up now with our final speaker, the client's perspective. So we've got Brian from the National Trust for Scotland, and I'll let him introduce himself to you guys properly.
Okay, hello all. Thank you, Emma, for that introduction, and to Antonio and Jessica for the case studies. What I'd like to do today, I've got a few slides just to talk quite briefly to just about why conservation accreditation is important, not only from a sort of client perspective, but also maybe I'm just trying to broaden some of the context of why it's important within Scotland as well, and just set some sort of parameters about what we're working to, and why we should be motivated to become conservation accredited as well. So hopefully this acts as a bit of an inspiration to get involved, but also see the wider picture. So a little bit about the National Trust for Scotland. We're a conservation charity. We own around 130 sites across the country. Those sites cover all different geographies. They vary from small vernacular buildings to some really important, significant listed buildings as well. We have a small team of building surveyors that look after the repair and maintenance of these sites. We own and manage in the region of about 1,600 built structures, and they can range from you know, a castle to, you know, a garden wall structure. So we have a big portfolio, and a small team of building surveyors that are responsible for the maintenance and repair of the estate. So they commission a lot of work in order to enable that maintenance and repair to happen. So from our perspective, why is conservation accreditation important? Well, it allows us to have a benchmark, a standard, once we go out to commission whatever professional that we are after for a particular task, whether that's in project management, surveying, architecture, engineering. And the benefit of that standard is that we know that the individuals that we commission have a common language. So you'll have maybe heard in some of the earlier studies there, you know, things like heritage impact assessment, conservation planning. We know what those mean, and by engaging a conservation accredited professional, they also know what those mean. So it gives us a sort of common language. By going to a conservation accredited individual, they have already demonstrated to the professional body the depth of understanding that they have on the topic and what they've brought into that. As an organisation, as a client, we operate within a set number of principles, and those principles are there to support staff when it comes to making decisions across the whole sort of piece of the estate. So this just isn't from a building perspective. You know, principles are also around about natural heritage, about our collections as well. So those broad principles kind of really help give a structure to some of the decision making that our staff do. So I've lifted that principle. It's a little bit wordy there. Yeah, there's a link there that takes you to the document, but in essence, I've highlighted what's important here is that the decisions emanate from an understanding of significance. Decisions on the built fabric are taken by appropriately qualified professionals, supported by processes. The decision should be shared with a wide audience. They should be documented so that we act as guardians of property, and so we are handing this property on to the next generation. So it's important that our decision making is also documented so that the next generation understand that. And that the decision making is framed by a number of the charters. You've heard Kinley talk about that a little bit more, and ultimately that supports a sort of a transparent process in terms of interventions. So that's why conservation accreditation is important to the NTS. I just thought I'd put this slide up just to kind of illustrate why it's important in a Scottish context as well. This is lifted from a slide that the Historic and Environment Scotland used to demonstrate the scale of the historic built environment. So within this diagram, you see at the top that there's 8,000 or more scheduled ancient monuments. You can see the 48,000 listed buildings. Again, the conservation areas. But underneath all that, and I think there's a common misconception that as a conservation accredited individual, you're dealing with that peak of the iceberg that's popping out of the water. Actually, it's really about what sits below that as well. So, within Scotland, we've got just under 500,000 traditionally constructed pre-1919 buildings. And all that is valued. So, it's recognised that Scotland has an exceptional built heritage. It's important that that's well looked after. The built heritage adds to general well-being of the Scottish population, and within the sector, it's a big sector, and you can see that again statistically it employs 55,000 jobs, which is a big percentage of Scottish employment, and we know the facts about what that contributes to the GVA of the country as well. So I think it's important to set all that in a context when we're talking about conservation. It is about that wide picture. And then when you look at that, you see that supported by the Scottish Housing Condition Survey, there are issues within that. The Housing Survey says that there's about 20% of properties that are traditionally constructed. So again, below that waterline on the iceberg illustration earlier. But it's not a great picture out there. 75% of the traditional buildings within that percentage show disrepair, 53% are in urgent disrepair. So there's a lot of volume of activity that is required, both to improve the position, but also just to kind of keep running on the spot, as it were. And so, broadly speaking, then, when you look at it in the whole, good decision making is broadly good for the historic environment. Good decision making is supported by a framework that you've seen illustrated previously, and then good decision making will create demand. And I think there are a number of issues which I'm going to talk on briefly later on, but I think that we've all got a part to play in order to both create that demand, stimulate the demand, and make life a little bit easier for those that are wanting to deliver good quality repair and maintenance on our traditional building sector. I think whilst it's important to note the charters and the like that have previously been mentioned, very specifically to Scotland, we have a strategy, and that strategy is called Our Place in Time. So basically anybody working within the historic environment is working within that strategy, and they should be promoting that strategy in their workplaces, but also in all their different work relationships that they come across. I think the strategy outside Scotland is probably recognised as good and groundbreaking and reasonably progressive. So it's important that we all champion that. And then within that strategy, there's a vision set out about how the historic environment should be looked after, with the intention that you have cross-cutting strategic priorities. So, the historic environment is beyond the general common audience of people sometimes wringing their hands about conservation decisions, but it relates to our tourism sector. It relates to those that are supporting the economy. So it cuts across all the different strategic priorities of the Scottish Government. And there are a number of kind of clear aspirations within that, understanding it, recording it, investigating it, caring for it well, and valuing it and celebrating it as well. So I would encourage you to look out Our Place in Time strategy, become familiar with that. I think that helps in general conversations, broadly speaking, if it comes to things that you're involved in within the historic built environment. And then, of course, we have an overarching policy that we all operate within as well. And it recognises that there are challenges within the sector, and we all have a part to play in trying to address some of these. So I just put to the side there, some of the key factors that come out of the historic environment policy, which is about good decision making will achieve the best outcomes, maximise benefits. Taking care of the historic environment is a shared responsibility. It contributes to positive well-being, as I mentioned earlier. We impact on communities across the piece. There are skills and capacity issues across the piece that we should be considering during our times when we are shaping projects or delivering our projects. And you've already heard mention the impact of climate change. So that does play a significant part in what it is that we do here. And so I suppose the other aspect to this is then looking at why conservation accreditation is important now. I think and I think all bodies struggle, and I'm thinking about the RICS at the minute as well, but all bodies struggle to demonstrate what their relevance is to the public. And if you cannot maintain and have that sort of clear relevance discussion, then you're on the back foot a little bit. And so I think conservation accreditation is relevant when you broaden the horizons at the minute. So on the slide there, you see the European Sustainable Development Goals, which we should all be, with all those within the built environment, are working within. But I think now, particularly, as we emerge out of a sort of post-COVID world, I think that the aspirations that come from dealing with good decisions within the built environment are really, really relevant these days. And I'd put up a link there. There was just a recent joint professional statement by it was pulled together by BEF's Built Environment Forum Scotland, but also those other professional bodies, the RITP, the RIAS, RICS, and the ICE, the Institute of Engineers, all have made a statement to say that in a post-COVID world where we're looking at making sustainable, resilient, inclusive recovery, then professionals play a big part in doing this. And I put this up because we're going to have to make a transition to a low carbon economy, and a big significant part of that is about good decisions within the built environment, and how good maintenance and repair is absolutely fundamental to achieving that. And so we probably need to think about just how that reflects a slightly different narrative change, in terms of maybe what we perceive as a slight narrow niche in conservation accreditation, but it's actually much more broader than that. And then again, I've just put this up in terms of just trying to emphasise relevance again. This is the Scottish Government National Performance Framework. So within the centre of the diagram are outcomes that Scottish Government are trying to achieve, and those do relate back to that earlier diagram on the United Nations Sustainable Development Diagram. But within here is just how the built environment relates to all those Scottish Government outcomes, and how certain activities can be measured to just emphasise, how our work fits within Scottish Government priority. And I think it's important to help kind of frame just what it is that we do in order to deliver a much bigger picture in terms of this. So again, I thought it's quite useful. This is coming from, there is a working group that comes out of one of our Place and Time strategy working groups that's really looking at trying to ensure that we make good decision making within the historic environment, and how that relates to a much more broader kind of social picture. So I think with some of that sort of context setting and just trying to broaden things a little bit, I just thought I'd try and sum up a little bit with with that slightly bigger picture from a National Trust perspective, from those that are practicing within the built environment. What does a good conservation project look like? And so it's worth thinking about these in your planning stages, how you can influence them, as an individual. And I think if you can address some of these, then it also does open up channels into alternative funding that potentially, you know, might bring, you know, a dialogue for your project into a different area of grant that allows you to sort of maximise your clients' resources. So anyway, and you know, there's a list down here, but you know, good record of conditioning, condition and understanding is important. Assessing the significance of the building, as you've heard already. Understanding authenticity of fabric, but also, you know, considering what those long-term needs are of that fabric. Developing a set of principles that you can kind of hang your decision-making upon, and then having a transparent process of heritage impact assessing as you go, so your decisions are completely transparent, are recorded and can be understood for future generations. I think developing a program, a project with a realistic program, because some of these aspirations are quite difficult to achieve, but realistic project planning will enable you to kind of fit these in. So getting that at the start, advising the client at the start that that needs to be realistic. A specification based on sound understanding of traditional materials and techniques. And that repairs should be honest and reversible, and their application does not jeopardise historic fabric. Back to some of the Scottish Government performance frameworks, you know, looking at procuring works that support localism, looking at procuring works that support skills opportunities as well. It's really important to consider these and all these added benefits that you get from that. Post-project, developing you know, a good, easy to deliver long-term maintenance plan. A robust archive of the project that can be put somewhere for future generations to understand. And then ultimately, you know, a good media strategy to a project. I think we tend to maybe kind of hide under a bushel a little bit, but yeah, using the platform of the project to kind of illustrate all those benefits that I talked about previously is really the kind of icing on the cake. So that's me, a little bit of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully you can see a slightly wider picture to the benefits of conservation accreditation. So if I can hand back, Gemma.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Brian. Thank you to all the speakers. We have a couple of questions. So the first one, for those in a private practice, a conservation approach can often be seen as a nice to have add-on or a statutory necessity, but what can the benefits be to private, commercial or cash-strapped public sector clients?
Could I come in there and attempt an answer on that one?
Yeah, of course.
Well, I think it was certainly mentioned a couple of times in some of the presentations that conservation is sometimes thought of as a sort of elitist activity, but one of the overriding messages we've been trying to get across is that it is often guided really by common sense, by looking after the heritage asset, and by looking after the heritage asset, and be that a humble building or a very posh, polite building, or a very rare building, it's giving it a future. And there's value in that future, and that can be commercialized as well. It's a commercial value. A building in good repair, well presented, with a great backstory that's understood and so on, is a great prospect for others to take it over. Mm-hmm. And everybody is really doing their bit to hand these heritage assets on to the next generation. Although many of us are owners of historic buildings, you know, we are owners for a particular period of time, and then we pass it on. So all of that has enormous value if we understand what we've got and we look after it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add, you know, I think it is about recognising that value and advising your client on what that value is, trying to quantify that somehow, and then, you know, celebrating what it is that we've got. I mean Scotland as a nation, you know, we have an abundance of stone-built buildings. There has been an enormous effort put in order to you know, build those end products, as it were. So we have a duty to be responsible to that. If you consider the volume of embodied carbon that has gone in to that particular asset, then who's it for us to say that we should either, you know, remove or ignore it? You know, I think as professionals we have a duty to you know, elevate the discussion on those things and articulate what that value is.
I think as well, just from a practical perspective, obviously minimal intervention can mean doing less. So, you know, there are opportunities to actually sometimes save money by explaining that you don't have to completely rip something out or start from scratch. You can actually fix it or alter it in a slightly less invasive way. So there can often be practical advantages and even sometimes money saving from taking a conservation approach.
Yeah, that would be what people want to hear, isn't it? A money saving. That's the one that people...
I mean, not always, but there are options.
Yeah.
I mean, as Jessica said, probably sometimes the best conservation approach could be the cheapest, but actually, you know, it's adding value to your asset as well, you know, by doing things properly and right. So that's, you know, and actually will bring some funding opportunities as well. So financially, there is a benefit there.
Okay, so there was another question. Is the RICS conservation accreditation open to non-RICS members?
Yes, yes, it is. You need to be a member of one of the other professional bodies that we recognise for the accreditation. So that it could include architects, architectural technologists, CIOB, and if there are any others, then we can look at those on a case-by-case basis. But yes, it is.
Great. That's good to know. And finally, there was a question actually for Kinley. What is the most common mistake or omission that you encounter from candidates in interview or application when presenting their experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's probably a couple of things. I touch on these briefly. One of them, I think, is the tendency to make the case study into a narrative. You know, I did this, we did that, which is it's necessary to be able to give the assessors and get across what you did, but it's crucial to try and get into the narrative somewhere, your thinking, your thought process, and linking that back to your understanding of the building, its significance, its setting, or what important aspect of it, be it its materials, its design, or something like that. It's the assessors have to try and gauge your actual understanding. So a narrative of how the job went is not enough. I think the other thing is be it not covering the conservation philosophy competency in a great deal of depth, and it does pay to stand back and think about what's meant by conservation philosophy. That there are tools which I kind of highlighted there: conservation planning, conservation statements, heritage impact assessments, and things like that. And these are useful. However, it was quite helpful to see Antonio's and Jessica's case studies, and they were looking at two very different buildings. But they did provide quite a lot of guidance on their justification for the decisions that they came to, there was no huge conservation plan provided there, and it wasn't really necessary. But there was conservation thinking going on, and a thread running right through that. Whether it was understanding the details and the significance of the interior of the Holyrood Park property, and the importance of looking at the details. They were probably a focus of that project, and it gives that building greater meaning when it's been repaired, when all those interventions are done. So it's worth reflecting on that, and trying to get some kind of context and an overall position set out, not necessarily on the entire project, but whatever you're focusing on, whatever issue it is you're focusing on.
Great, thank you. So we don't have any more burning questions in the chat, but everyone is welcome to contact us, and we'll put you in touch with whomever you had a question for. And we've run over a little bit, so we'll end here. And I'd like to just thank all the speakers for joining us, and we really hope that it was useful and you will be able to continue your career into conservation. And yeah, if anyone's joining us again tomorrow, we're going to be joined by both the Institute of Conservation and the Conservation Accreditation Register for Engineers to hear about some information on how to become conservation accredited in their industry. So thank you again, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your night.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.